Okay, welcome everyone to our webinar on planning for junior year SATs and ACTs. We're really excited to have you here. By way of an introduction, for those who don't know me, my name's Jim Wismer and I'm the director here at Ivy Experience. So we are a comprehensive college prep company. We offer services in college counseling, essay and application coaching, SAT, ACT, AP, and other standardized test prep, and academic subject tutoring. We started as a small company in the Philadelphia area, but since we've worked with students in more than 40 states and over 20 countries, and we've helped them be accepted to more than 500 different colleges and universities. For our YouTube audience, please like, subscribe, and share our content around. We do these to dispel myths and misconceptions in the college admissions space, so your help in spreading our reach is invaluable. One quick housekeeping item for the people here live. Please use the Q&A feature or the chat function in Zoom to ask any questions you have throughout this presentation. We will answer them all at the end. So, just to give a little more background on myself, as the director of Ivy Experience, one of my main roles here is to work with our families on test prep planning. In other words, I help families figure out what test dates they should target, whether they should focus on the SAT or ACT. And the goal of tonight's presentation is to kind of give you all the big picture of that. I see that on our participants list are some people I've had individual conversations with about their own prep plans, and I'm always happy to have those. I'll post in the chat a little later tonight my Calendly link if you'd like to set up a one-on-one meeting to discuss your student's situation in particular. And then without further ado, why don't we go ahead and jump into our content for the evening? So, we always like to frame our webinars by first talking about what is in a student's control in college admissions. So, there are all kinds of things that are going to factor into the decisions that colleges make about who to admit and who not to. Things like your zip code and what other students at your high school are doing and your demographic information that you cannot control, right? But the time and effort that students put into this process that is actually rewarded is on the things that they can control. And when we talk about standardized testing, I like to put that into the context of these factors so that you understand how it fits into the bigger puzzle. So, the five factors that a student can really control are their grades and academic rigor, standardized tests, which is what we're here to talk about tonight, letters of recommendation from teachers, which while students don't write them, they form the relationships that are the basis of those letters, extracurricular activities, then finally the applications themselves and especially the essays that are part of those applications. And we include on here the college list as well. While your college list won't dictate whether you're admitted to a specific college, it is going to have a big influence on your outcomes in this project more broadly. So it makes a lot of sense, to put your time into these six areas as a way to help yourself in this process. Now, academic kind of profile of a college applicant is going to be based on grades and academic rigor as well as standardized test scores. Grades and academic rigor are often considered the most important factors in college admissions. I like to use an analogy to football in this case, and specifically the NFL draft. NFL draft players are mostly evaluated on what we call their college game film. Coaches watch film of how those players played in college. It's a long sample size. You're able to see how they played week in, week out, play in, play out, every play that they've ever played, right? On the other hand, their combine testing, how fast they can run 40 yards, how high they can jump, how many times they can bench press 225 pounds. These are important as well, and they offer context to that academic record. So the idea is that the players who are the most draftable are the ones who have strong game film and the combine testing numbers to back up that game film. It allows coaches and general managers to be more confident in the players that they're selecting. Well, you can see that there's an obvious analogy to college admissions here. One very important factor to consider here, and if you've ever been on our webinars before, you know we talk about this a lot, but it bears repeating because it's often the thing that parents are the most surprised by when I speak to them for the first time, and that's grade inflation. So what I have here is data on the percentage of freshmen at American colleges and universities that have reported that they had at least an A minus average in high school. The number when this data started to be tracked by UCLA's Higher Ed Research Institute in 1966 was 21.8%. That number has shot up to 84% of college students who had at least an A minus average in high school. So we can see that grades don't tell us the same story that they once did. To illustrate this point further, I use an example of the University of Pittsburgh. It's one of our flagship state schools in Pennsylvania, which is where we were founded. So we work with a lot of students applying to this school every year. Well, this is from the Common Data Set. That's a repository of college admissions data that most colleges publish, and you can find it by Google. You can ask, ChatGPT about it, but verify because it's not always right and it's not always looking at the right link or the right year. But these stats kind of show the situation. Now, Pitt uses a weighted GPA where students can get a boost to their GPA for taking honors and AP classes. But we can see that the percentage of students with at least a 4.0 GPA is over half, 61% of those students, and that the average GPA at the University of Pittsburgh is 4.08. And University of Pittsburgh is a selective school. It's a flagship state school, but we're not talking about one of the most competitive schools in the country here. So this is an important thing to keep in mind just to kind of characterize the situation with grades. Most students are getting mostly A's. One of the things that I hear most commonly from parents who call in, they say, hey, my student is a really strong student in the classroom, but the test scores just don't match the grades. Well, the truth is, when we're looking at a situation where most students, 84%, have at least an A minus average, if your student is a straight A student with a handful of B's, that actually makes them a pretty average student. The average SAT score in the country is actually a 1010. So often there's a disconnect between kind of what grades and test scores should be aligned. And that's mostly a relic of a past time when grades, strong grades, were a lot harder to come by. Test scores, when we compare them again with this steady increase in grades, are standardized, meaning that they tell us the same thing across times and locations. So what I have here is the average ACT score in the country over a similar time period. Now I'm using ACT and not SAT because the SAT has redesigned and used different scoring curves over this time period. The ACT's score has been the same the whole way. Their scoring curve has not changed. And you can see that the average ACT score in the country hasn't changed much. In fact, if we zoom in on the most recent handful of years, you actually see that this has continued to decline a little bit, especially in light of the pandemic and students missing, some critical in-person math instruction. So the test scores tell us the same thing across locations and time periods, and that's why they're important to colleges. When we zoom in on that pandemic trajectory, again, you can see that we're in actually a sharper downward trend. It has started to level off a bit. I need to update my graph for next year. Now, that brings us to, what is the point of standardized testing? Well, the most important thing standardized testing can do for a college is predict which students will be successful on campus. So I have here a quote from Emory's Dean of Admissions. We're not as trusting, frankly, of GPA these days. Students are trying their hardest, but grades are definitely inflated and not as connected to true class performance as they used to be. So we're seeing here an admission on behalf of a well-known university that, they're not relying on grades as data as often as they have in the past or as much as they have in the past. And this is in context of them actually saying they're relying on things like SAT, ACT, and AP scores more than they have in the past. So the number one thing that a standardized test score does is that it's been shown to be the most predictive factor for student success at selective colleges and universities, meaning that it correlates more strongly with your freshman GPA than your high school GPA does. Now, this makes sense when you consider that with grade inflation comes grade compression, meaning that GPAs are not as different as they used to be. With GPAs not being as different as they used to be, that means that they can't predict things like how well you do in college as effectively as they could in the past. Now, the other thing a test score will allow you to do is, or allow a college to do, is compare a student with their local context. So when you apply to a college, your high school transcript will be sent. With that goes something called a school profile that your counseling office at school puts together. That school profile includes data on your high school. It'll include things like the percentage of students who end up attending a four-year college or university, the average SAT or ACT score, what APs are offered, etc. And they do this so that colleges can have a good snapshot of what your high school is like. Now, if you're applying in state to a state school, that state school is going to know your high school very well because they're probably talking about double digit applications year over year, every year, right? And admissions officers are assigned regionally, which means that those regional admissions officers end up knowing your high school pretty well. But if you are an applicant in, Florida applying to a small school in California, well, then in that situation, that admissions officer in California probably has little to no context on your Florida high school. And so that's where the school profile can be really valuable. So in standardized testing terms, colleges can see your test score and compare that with the test scores of students from your high school to determine, kind of how well you're doing relative to students of a similar background. Last thing to note here is that this is part of a holistic review process. So, US college admissions is holistic for better and for worse. And that means they consider the whole human being. So, we're talking grades, we're talking test scores, we're talking extracurricular activities, things like demonstrated interest can factor in. They're looking at students from a very big picture. And that means that while standardized testing is a very important piece of that puzzle, it is certainly not the whole puzzle. So, test optional is sort of the new normal in college admissions in some ways. So, test optional exists on a spectrum, and this is one of the things I really try to drive home for our families who are confused about what test optional is and what it means. Uh, Test optional just means you can submit your scores or not, and they will take your application fee and process your application. It doesn't actually tell you anything about your likelihood of success, whether that score is attached or not. And so when we consider what is such and such a school test optional, these four middle policies that I've laid out here are all called test optional. And so I define them as test preferred, slight test advantage, test agnostic, and truly test optional. But again, if you just look up is so and so test optional, if they fall into any of these four categories, the answer is just going to be yes from Gemini or wherever you're searching. So the important thing to note here of the test required schools, and let me just kind of explain what you're looking at in the slide here. I have broken down the US News and World Report top 100 schools. I don't endorse that ranking system. I just use it because it's convenient and easy to find, and other people know what you're talking about when you use it. So I've broken down those top 100 schools by what their testing policy is, according to what they're actually doing in admissions, meaning what percentage of their students actually submitted test scores and were admitted. And by doing that, which is also information available in the common data set, you can break down into these categories. Test required is actually the second largest of these categories. And test required is going to be kind of top heavy, meaning the very most competitive schools are going to tend to be test required at a higher rate than, schools say you're going to see it a lot more often in schools, 1 through 50 than in schools 51 through 100. So that's important to note. And then test blind, it's 10 schools, but actually those 10 schools are almost only the University of California system, which is going to include UCLA, Berkeley, University of California, San Diego, which are all top 100 schools, and the Cal State system as well. So even though it says 10 schools, it's really two very large university systems more than anything else, and then a handful of smaller schools. So when we talk about test blind, that's a very kind of rare policy and really only a West Coast thing. And when we talk about test required, we're seeing each year more schools come back to requiring tests. Most of them are going to fall into the, most competitive schools in the country category, 7 of the 8 Ivies, MIT, Georgetown, Stanford, Caltech. Or they're going to be large state schools like, the University of Florida, like University of Georgia, Ohio State, Auburn, Alabama, etc. And then most other colleges fall into this spectrum in the middle where they say they're test optional and they all mean different things by that. So it's important to keep this in mind because having a strong score is still the same benefit it always has been in this process, but test optional is something you should consider as well. Now, when we talk about the SAT and ACT and planning for the two, one of the big decisions is, well, which one do I take? So I'm going to talk a little bit about the differences between the two tests and how you can make an informed decision about which one's best for you. So the format of the SAT in its current iteration, it's an online test. or rather on a computer, it's taken as four sections, two reading and writing and two math. And you're going to get a score out of 1600 with 800 points in reading and writing and 800 points in math. In terms of its challenges, and these would all be considered challenges relative to its counterpart, the ACT. The SAT is digital only, where the ACT gives you a paper option. Some students actually, believe it or not, still do prefer paper testing. So that's can be an advantage for those students. There are limited annotation tools on the SAT because it's a computer-only exam. So on the ACT, you're taking it on paper. You can mark up passages and questions as often as you want. The digital SAT does have built-in annotation tools, so you can cross off answers, highlight in different colors, a lot of useful things, but you're not going to have the same freedom and flexibility that you have with a pencil in your hand on a piece of paper, being able to write, draw, cross out, highlight, underline, anything you want. The verbal questions on the SAT are generally considered a little more challenging. The level of the vocabulary will be a little bit higher, and the level of diction, more generally, sentence structure will be more complex. And you'll see passages that are poetry and passages that are written in kind of older dialects of English from, say, the 1800s. And then finally, the SAT is adaptive, which can kind of confuse students, even though it's really nothing to worry about. I'm going to give you a brief explanation of what that means. So, in the reading and writing or the math section, and both sections work the same way this way, every student's first module in that section is the same difficulty level. It actually, most of the time, testers in the same room won't have identical module ones, but they'll be the same difficulty level. College Board will do things like shuffle the order of the questions to prevent cheating. But everybody gets that standard difficulty module one. Your performance in that first module dictates which second module you get. So if you don't do as well in the first module, you'll test into a lower module one, lower difficulty, that is. And if you do better, you'll test into a higher difficulty second module. And that will dictate what kind of spectrum of scores you're eligible to get. So in other words, to get an 800, you're obviously going to have to test into the harder second module. Now, there's not an exact cutoff for where these happen, and that's why we have this bottom chunk represented as a spectrum, because it's possible to do really well in the easier second module or really poorly in the harder second module, and potentially score, lower or higher that way. But the reason I bring this up is just to explain that strategically, there is actually no difference in taking an adaptive test versus a non-adaptive test. When this first came out that the SAT was going adaptive, I got all kinds of crazy calls from students and parents like, well, would it be better for me to get some questions wrong on purpose in module one? Because I think I can really crush the easier second module, but I'm not so sure about how well I could do in the harder second module. The answer to that is a definite no. And that's because you're just lowering your score by getting questions wrong. The questions count in both modules. And to put this another way, on the old version of the SAT, when it wasn't adaptive, every question counted for the same amount and it wasn't moduled out like this. If you had missed a bunch of questions in the first half of the test, you were still cut off from the high scores. So this is sort of a distinction without a difference because your performance in the early stages of the test has always dictated what eligible scores you can actually receive. This is just a different structure to it. It can sometimes mess with students mentally, but with test prep and understanding how this actually works, this really shouldn't remain an obstacle for any student. The ACT is the SAT's counterpart. Historically, it's been more popular in the Midwest. It's from Iowa, whereas the College Board is from, New Jersey and now New York. So it's more of a kind of Northeast and West Coast thing. ACT more the middle of the country. The ACT has three main sections. There's an English section, a math section, and a reading section. Each of those gets a score out of 36, and your overall score is the average of those scores out of 36. Now, the ACT has two optional sections. One of them is science. This was mandatory until recently, so parents, if you had an older student, it might be news to you that ACT science is optional. The ACT science optional section we recommend most students take. And that's because the science section of the ACT was only recently made optional. Colleges are used to having that information, and generally speaking, it's one of the most preppable sections of the test, meaning that students can often do quite well with it once they dedicate themselves to prep. The writing section of the ACT is an actual timed essay. Students should not take it. It is nothing but pain and there is no reward. So, in other words, no college actually uses the writing section of the ACT. So, there's really no reason to ever take it. Some states use it as like a graduation requirement when they don't have their own state design test for a high school graduation requirement. That's why it still exists, but do not worry about it from a college admissions standpoint. Relative to the SAT, the challenges on the ACT include timing, meaning that the ACT is a faster paced test. You're asked to do more questions in less time. On the other hand, the trade-off is that you're going to have that lower level vocabulary, simpler passage structure. So it's actually going to be somewhat easier to finish questions quickly. And that's the kind of counterbalance between the two tests. The math content on the ACT is broader than on the SAT. So notice I didn't say it's more difficult, but it's going to cover a wider range of topics, more topics from statistics and probability, a few topics from pre-calculus, some things like sequences and series, matrices. And these are all things that you can learn, quite easily if you put the time into it. They're not necessarily extremely complex, but they are just extra topics that you wouldn't have to cover for the SAT. The SAT focuses more on kind of taking math you're very familiar with, but then making the logic and the problem solving of the questions more difficult. Whereas the ACT is more of a straightforward execution test that covers a broader array of topics. And then the paper version of the ACT is the better version to take. The ACT released their computer-based version broadly as a result of losing market share to the SAT because basically students really liked the digital version of the SAT. They wanted to take the test on paper and so, or sorry, on the computer. So ACT said, sure, take the test on a computer. But what they did is they basically put up their paper test behind glass on a screen. Or screens aren't made of glass anymore, but you know what I mean. The idea here, just to kind of illustrate what the problem is, we actually see students test more slowly on the ACT when they take the test on a computer. And that's because the ACT, the way it works in the reading section, you get a long passage with about 9 questions attached to it, right? So in that reading section, when you take the test on paper, you've got double pages, you've got passages and questions, and everything is in your peripheral vision the whole time. On the SAT, on the other hand, when they redesigned for the digital test, they shortened the passages so that each question gets its own passage. And that means that everything displays just on a standard laptop or tablet screen all at once. So everything can actually be in the student's periphery. Believe it or not, scrolling up and down and the eye tracking that requires when you're constantly moving where the text is, scanning for information is much slower that way. And it has a demonstrable impact on student scores. In fact, the released grading curves on a digital and paper ACT are different for this reason, even though every question is the same. So we recommend paper because this is a test designed for paper, and often that's going to be a determining factor for who does better on which. Speaking of who does better on which, so the most important thing I can tell you is that you really should do SAT and ACT diagnostic testing. We're going to send SAT and ACT diagnostic testing to everyone who attends this webinar. So have no fear, we'll be sending it along to you by the weekend. But basically, we offer SAT and ACT diagnostic testing. The idea here is you try both tests and you pursue the test that you're likely to get better results on. So the typical way to do this is basically to see if you have a head start on one test or the other. If you do much better on one, then you take that. If you do much better on the other, then you take that. If you take diagnostics through us, we'll grade them. We'll give you a report on which one we recommend and why, and then I'll offer a call to talk through the results, our recommendation, a prep plan, and all of that good stuff. A lot of the times you can iron out your prep plan before taking the diagnostic because your timing for the test won't matter so much if it's SAT or ACT. Timelines for preparation are the same between the two exams, but the diagnostic test is a nice way to just know which one you will get the most for your money and time spent on test prep, by doing that first. So, when should you take the SAT or ACT? I recommend students take the test for the first time during junior year. So there's a fall timeline students can test on and a spring timeline. And which timeline to follow really depends on when you'll have completed Algebra 2 and geometry. So if you are someone who by the end of 10th grade here, you've already completed Algebra 2 and geometry or the equivalent in your integrated math curriculum if you're at an integrated math school, then in that case, my advice is generally to prep over the summer and early fall. Aim to knock out your testing in the fall of junior year. The goal here is basically your own mental health preservation because the spring of junior year is the busiest time of high school. Over the past 2 months, I can tell you that our homework compliance from our juniors was the lowest it's been, and it's that way every year. We get the least outside of session work from our juniors in the spring months as far as SAT and ACT prep are concerned because they're worried about APs, final papers and final projects, and proms and spring sports. And there's just so much that piles up in that spring of junior year. Their college search is heating up, right? So many things that it's really best if you can knock this out before winter break. However, if you are a student who's taking Algebra 2 or geometry during junior year, then you actually do need to wait till the spring to be able to do your best on these tests. Because having that math presented in the classroom, plenty of time to master it, and preparing on top of that is usually going to lead to your best results. And you can still front load some of your preparation into the summer before junior year. For example, you could do a lot of prep on the verbal sections and then some math prep on the areas that you're already up to speed on. And then the idea is you leave those more advanced math topics till the end and you resume prep closer to the spring. That's a good option too. Or you could wait until, later in the process completely to just do your entire prep process leading into one of those spring tests. Normally that means you're starting prep around November, December of junior year. You also want to consider your own extracurricular and real life schedule. And I say this because, maybe you're someone who's gone to summer camp every year of your life. I'm not going to tell you to stop going to summer camp to be able to do test prep over the summer. You should, we can find another time to do test prep if summer camp's really important to you. If you're a fall athlete and hey, from, when practices start in mid-August through, that November-ish time that fall sports end, depending on where you are in the playoffs, that's my busiest time of year. Well, then in that case, obviously we want to wait until, after that and maybe front load a little prep before that to make this make sense for you. So there's an individual element to all this. I'm kind of advising on the broad timelines because I'm talking to a whole group of people at once here. But this is why we offer free individual planning calls for families because it just tends to be the case that it's much easier to make these decisions on an individual level. So often we get the question about what SAT and ACT test dates have the easiest curves. And typically this question is asked from the standpoint of, oh, well, if the seniors test in the fall, why would I want to test in the fall as a junior? Because then the seniors are going to break the curve. They have a year on me in terms of math and biological growth of their brain and all of that good stuff. This is a misunderstanding of how the test curves work. The curves of the SAT and ACT are predicted. They are not based on the performance of the students testing on that given day outside of specific data they pull for what they call equating purposes. But the curve is generally speaking, it's not like a college, calculus curve where, okay, two people in that classroom are going to get an A, right? It's more based on a general population that's controlled for age, controlled for, whatever other variables that they control for in their process. They norm the scores, and then it's possible for one curve to have an easier, or sorry, one test date to have an easier or harder curve. It's also even more possible for an individual test date to just gel with you or not. So for instance, there may be anywhere between 7 and 9 comma rule questions on the ACT English section. Well, if you're uncomfortable with comma rules, you'd rather there be 7. If you're really good at them, you'd rather there be 9, right? And where it falls in that spectrum is going to dictate how easy that particular ACT date was for you, right? That is often more important than just which one had a harder curve, generally speaking. And the harder and easier curves are just random. There's no clean way to predict them. So I want to take a moment to just kind of look at the test dates for the year. And what I have here in orange are the test dates that people who are planning to prep this summer would aim for a first test. For the SAT, you might take your first SAT in August, September, or October. For the ACT, you might take that first test in September or October. And then the goal is to be done by the December test date so that you don't have to worry about this in spring of junior year at all. For a spring tester, for the ACT, you might take it for the first time in February or April. If you're still wrapping that math up, you might look more towards April. If you already had that math done and you were just like waiting for a fall sport to end or something like that, you might target February because it'll be farther removed from that end of year rush. And then you can retest in April. For the SAT, you're typically targeting March as a first date if you're on that spring timeline. May, if for some reason March doesn't make sense for you. The question I often get when advising families about, should you focus on the SAT or ACT is like, well, can't we just do both and then submit to colleges, whichever one is the stronger of the two scores? And the answer to that is yeah, you can take both. I don't advise investing time, money, and energy into preparing for both. If you think of test prep as an investment of, your students' time, your family's money, and everybody in your household's stress to some extent, then you want that investment pointed in one direction for best results. If you split it in two different directions, you're going to get less growth twice. Whereas if it's all in one direction, you're going to get more growth once. Now, generally speaking, preparing for one of these tests makes you better at the other one. I mean, commas are commas and triangles are triangles, right? The underlying content is very similar. Multiple choice test taking strategies are kind of fundamental and not that different from one test to another. But there are things you will practice for the SAT, but not the ACT, and vice versa, and things that show up more frequently on one test or the other, so that a most efficient prep plan will be aimed at the specific test that you want to take. So, for efficiency purposes, you want to pick one and commit. But yeah, you can always try the other one if you want to see how it goes. And chances are you will improve at the other one by preparing for the one. So this idea of, well, should I just try the other one, makes a lot of sense for very high scoring students who just need to have their best day on the right day. And they might be equally well suited to both tests. Okay, registering for these tests. Registration for the fall test dates is open for the SAT, and for the whole school year is open for ACT. I recommend registering as soon as you have decided on a test date. Registration typically closes about a month out from the test, and you can register late up until about 2 weeks before the test. But individual test centers can book up. This is especially important if we have anyone from California here. California is a state with relatively limited test center availability, and it's also more of an issue for anyone who's rural or international. So if you fall into any of those categories, you want to think about signing up well in advance because you're just going to have access to fewer testing centers. But for most students, I recommend just signing up early because you want to drive less on the morning of the test. It means more sleep. We know how teenagers are with their sleep, right? So, 10 minutes less driving on the morning of the test can actually make a difference. You'll enter your zip code for the test date you're interested in, and it will show you all options within X miles of your zip code, and you set that radius. They will ask you for a bunch of optional information. If you choose to provide that optional information, they will promptly sell it to colleges so that they can market to you. Some students like this. For some students, getting a letter in the mail, from a university addressed to them makes them excited about this process. And if you think that might be your student, then you probably do want that. You'll get junk mail for the next couple of years, but you will, maybe find out about schools you might not otherwise have found out about. However, if you are not interested in that, you do not have to fill in any of that optional information. Both tests will give you the option to have your scores automatically sent to colleges. Do not opt to do that. Very simple reason. You want to see your scores before you decide whether a college gets to see them or not. And it only costs like $10 to $20, depending on which test, to submit those scores to colleges later. So it's a paltry sum in the grand scheme of a college education, and you just want to keep that freedom and flexibility for yourself. I'm going to mention this briefly, but essentially, we have a blog post discussing SAT and ACT accommodations and the process for getting those. I'm not going to talk about this too long because it doesn't apply to everyone, but you can always book a call with me if you have questions about getting your accommodations in place, whether you're a prospective student or a current student of ours. I'm always happy to just kind of advise on that. It's a pretty straightforward process, but it's also one of those things where, probably three different AIs will tell you three different things, and four different blog posts will tell you four different things. I can just give you quick, simple information that's worked for our students for the 15 years we've been doing this. So if you have any questions about that, just let me know. Next, I want to talk about kind of fundamentals of SAT and ACT prep. And these fundamentals are hallmarks of how we do test prep here at Ivy Experience, but that's because we believe that they're extremely important. So whether you work with us or not, this would be my advice to you in terms of test prep. Do practice in authentic test conditions. And this means taking full timed tests and taking them straight through with a 10-minute snack/bathroom break. That's what you'll get during the real test between the middle two sections of the test. So you don't necessarily always have to practice this way, but you want to have practiced this way often enough that when you go to take the real test, it just feels like another day at the office. You want to use the results from these practice tests to identify and target areas of personal need. In other words, figure out where you're missing the most questions and use that to identify where you should devote your time and attention to improve. And finally, be consistent. So it's better to do less more consistently than to do, 4 hours, not think about it for 3 weeks, 5 hours, not think about it for 3 weeks. It's better to space things out and do a little bit over a longer period of time. So once you take the test, you wait for scores. The scores come back pretty quickly. SAT scores will come back on the second Friday after your test. ACT scores will begin to come back on the second Tuesday after your test, but they'll trickle out for about a 6 week period from there. Most students will get them on the second Tuesday. Students with extended time will get their scores later in the process, specifically if they took the test over multiple days because of special testing accommodations. That's the term ACT uses. So that's something to keep in mind that if you have that accommodation, probably you're looking at a longer score release timeline. Another important thing to know when making a test prep plan is super scoring. So super scoring allows students to combine section scores across multiple test dates to create a new overall score. This rewards students who prep for specific sections when they retake the test. So maybe you take the SAT and you're happy with your math score, but you still want to work on reading and writing. That means the next time you take it, you could just focus your prep on reading and writing and really focus on just improving that. So it's nice because it's a more efficient way to spend your time in the prep process. Not every school super scores, but more than half of the schools that our students tend to be the most interested in do. So that's why we mention it when we're talking with families about plans for retesting, because it is a significant part of the process. Last thing I want to note, this obviously isn't relevant to SAT and ACT, but AP scores have a growing importance in college admissions. I showed you that quote from Jason Latting of Emory. But, historically, AP scores used to exist simply for college credit and placement. So if you had AP Spanish in high school, you could get credit for your foreign language requirement at college, right? If you had Calculus BC, then maybe you could test out of an introductory calculus course at college. The credit and placement policies of different universities are very much alive and well, but they differ quite a bit from one university to the next. So you're not guaranteed to get placement or credit for your AP scores, but it can really help you. I was the kind of nerd that was able to enter college as a sophomore because of AP credits. So I'm a big believer here. It allowed me to add on a second major, and it was a big benefit to me to not have to waste time with general education requirements and jump right into the classes I was interested in taking. They can be more important for your admissions journey when you're not submitting an SAT or ACT score. So, in other words, if you are a student who believes that test optional is the right way for you to go and SAT and ACT aren't going to work out, first of all, talk to me about that first because we can talk about, would it make sense? What would prep look like? What could we expect from it? Second of all, if you've made that decision, then just know that colleges are still looking for third-party validation of your high school grades because that's one of the points of standardized testing. And that third party validation can come in the form of AP scores. So it could be the case that you're not great at the format of the SAT and ACT, but maybe you're awesome at chemistry. And if you can rock the AP chemistry exam, then that can really help you in a situation where you're not submitting SAT or ACT scores. And these tests are always going to come the first 2 weeks of May. Make sure you think about what you need to do to prep well in advance of that. I can't tell you how many people we had in the second half of April reach out to us for AP tutoring this year. I think it was a new record for us. I start talking to families about this in February if we're just preparing for the exam. But we work with some students on AP courses, gosh, starting in the fall when school starts, and they know they're going to need a little extra support to keep up with the coursework. So if you're planning to prepare for these exams, just give yourself plenty of time to do it because cramming rarely is the best way. All right, with that, thank you all for your time tonight. I appreciate it. I hope you found this helpful. I'm going to drop a link in the chat for anyone who's interested in speaking with me about a plan for your student in particular. And then if you have any questions you'd like me to address now, you can go ahead and drop them in the Q&A, and you can drop them in the chat function as well. There's my Calendly link in the chat. Our first question has come in, and it is, can you explain how the timing for SAT and ACT differs for athletic recruits? Yeah, happy to do that. I'll keep it brief because I know not everyone here is an athletic recruit. But essentially, athletic recruits want to have scores sooner. So each sport has a date at which coaches are allowed to get in touch with students directly. And ideally, you want to have an official test score for that date because your test score can affect how recruitable you are as an athlete. Typically, coaches are given averages by the admissions department that their teams have to hit. And at some test optional schools, they might be given a percentage of students that are allowed to not submit scores. What they want to do from their point of view is spend their low scores on the students, or rather the athletes that they want the most. And so you make yourself more recruitable as an athlete if you have a strong score because that might help raise the team's average. So something to consider there. But generally speaking, it means talking at the end of 10th grade now, you probably want to start prep right away and take the test as soon as possible so that you have an official score to share with coaches. If that's not going to be feasible for you, you can share a PSAT score from the previous year. But probably you could do better on a more recent test, so it would help you to do that. Next question. I've seen that some schools, such as Yale and NYU, have test flexible policies. Can you explain what those are? Sure. So, a test flexible policy means that a college accepts AP scores or IB scores or scores from some exams that they use only overseas, like the A levels in the British system, instead of an SAT or ACT. So I believe NYU's policy is that you can submit three AP scores instead of an SAT or ACT score to kind of satisfy your standardized testing component for them. Now, they are test optional also, where you can choose to submit none. But if you do choose to submit testing, it can be either the SAT or ACT, or it can be three APs or three IB scores. Next question. Can you select which test scores get sent and which don't? For example, send your October scores, but not September. Good question. So broadly speaking, yes. You just select to send individual test scores, and by selecting to send individual test scores, they're just getting those individual test scores. And that's true for SAT and ACT. In a super scoring context, typically you're only going to be sending the scores that make up the super score. The caveat to that is that there are a few colleges out there. The only one that comes to mind is Georgetown that asks you to submit all of your scores. And in that situation, you don't want to get caught in a lie. You should submit all of your scores, but technically you still could just send them one score, but they'd probably be able to tell. All right. It looks like that's all of our questions for tonight. So again, use my Calendly link in the chat if you want to set up a call with me to talk about your student situation in particular. And we're always here for all of your standardized testing and college admissions questions. So thanks everybody for joining us tonight and hope you enjoy the start of summer after Memorial Day here. Bye bye.